All right, we might get started, and then those that aren't here can feel free to join as they arrive in the lobby. Good afternoon, everybody. I just wanted to thank you all for joining us today. Firstly, I just have some brief logistical remarks. So we are recording this meeting for those that are unable to make it. So to help preserve the quality of the briefing, both the audio and the visuals, can you please make sure that your microphones are muted and that your video is switched off, unless you're a member of our panel. Secondly, after our experts have given their overview on challenge trials, we're planning on opening up the floor to questions for those of you in attendance. So to best facilitate this process, if at any point during the following discussion you have a question, please feel free to submit that question in the chat box along with your name and affiliation, and I'll make sure to pose it to our panel. And finally, this is, it will not surprise you to know, the first time that I'm chairing a congressional briefing via Microsoft Teams. So I thank you for your patience with any ensuing difficulties, technical or otherwise, that we might experience. So hopefully that all got through okay. And I just want to take this opportunity very briefly to say a few words to introduce Congressman Bill Foster. So Congressman Foster holds a PhD in physics from Harvard and is a businessman representing the 11th Congressional District of Illinois. He serves on the House Committee of Financial Services and is the chairman of the Financial Services Committee's Task Force on Artificial Intelligence. He's also a member of the Science, Space and Technology Committee and the chairman for the Investigations and Oversight Subcommittee. I personally have a lot of respect for Congressman Foster's approach to legislation, which has been to promote the implementation of best scientific practices in order to achieve policy. Back in April, Congressman Foster sponsored an open letter to the HHS, urging federal agencies to take the steps to speed up the development for a COVID vaccine. He recognized that one such approach to this could be human challenge trials, and worries that without a more rapid process, the pandemic will continue to inflict enormous social and economic costs upon society. So with that, I'd like to invite Congressman Foster to give his opening remarks.
Well, I want to, first off, thank you all for being here. And also thank you for giving 75% of my opening remarks. So this is great. Well, for those of you who might not know me, I'm Congressman Bill Foster. I'm a scientist and businessman. And I sometimes introduce myself as saying that I represent 100% of the strategic reserve of physicists in the US Congress. But I serve on the House Science Committee as chair of the Investigations and Oversight Committee, which is a rather sleepy committee given the lack of anything to investigate in terms of science policy in the current situation. I also serve on the Financial Services Committee, where I'm chairing the Task Force on Artificial Intelligence. Most recently, I was honored to be appointed on the House Select Committee on the coronavirus crisis, where, among other things, we're going to have Anthony Fauci and others before our committee at the end of this week. So we may learn a little bit more about what the plans are to hopefully move forward with human challenge trials. When my letter was mentioned, and I think it pretty much speaks for myself, I think it really has stood the test of time, even in COVID time, that it's actually, the issues here were clearly stated, early in the year by a number of people, including some of those present here. And I think the things that may have changed in the last couple of months are, first, that it seems increasingly likely that our job is not going to be to find the first vaccine, but the best vaccine. That we're seeing, very good immune responses from basically anything that presents the spike protein to our immune system, which is wonderful news. It also means that it is increasingly likely that things like antibody therapeutics will provide a rescue therapy, thereby removing a lot of the moral issues that many people, I think mistakenly, feel should cause us to not proceed with human challenge trials. So I guess I don't want to, we've got a lot more experts on the call than me on this. I just want to thank everyone. Thank everyone here who's maintaining an open mind on this. And we look forward to hearing what's happening, not only in the US, but around the world. So thank you all, and let's proceed.
Thank you, Congressman Foster. So just before we begin with the expert panel discussion, I did want to take a moment to introduce our four panelists and give a brief overview of their illustrious careers. So firstly, Dr. Nir Eyal is the Henry Rutgers Professor of Bioethics at Rutgers University and the lead author on the first peer-reviewed work that called for the implementation of challenge trials to assess vaccines in the COVID landscape. His past work spans many areas of research ethics, but this does include the ethics of emerging infection vaccine trials and high-risk clinical trials. Dr. Mark Lipsich is a professor of epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the director of the Center for Communicable Disease Dynamics at Harvard. His group's work played a leading role in the analysis of and response to the 2003 SARS and the 2009 H1N1 pandemics. And I also have it on good authority that he is the most read epidemiologist on Twitter. Dr. Stanley Plotkin is the Emeritus Professor of Pediatrics at the University of Pennsylvania and a prominent figure in the history of vaccinology. His work on vaccine development for rotavirus, anthrax, oral polio, rabies, and chickenpox has led to a significant reduction in the morbidity and mortality from infectious diseases across the latter half of the 20th century. And finally, we have Dr. Rich Roberts, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at the New England Biolabs in Massachusetts. He is a leading biochemist and molecular biologist and was also awarded the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1993 for the discovery of introns and gene splicing, and is therefore indirectly responsible for many of the hours I've spent poring over high school biology textbooks. So thank you for that, Rich. And so to begin, I wanted to start, Mark, with you. So you were one of the authors of the piece that got both me and many of those present interested in challenge studies for COVID-19. Could you give us a basic overview of what a human challenge study is?
Sure, and thank you all for being here, and thanks, Sophie, for the opportunity. A human challenge trial is very simply a study in which humans are challenged with a virus, that is, administered a virus deliberately by scientists to assess, in this case, whether a vaccine works and how well it works, to protect them against infection and also potentially against transmitting to others. The reason why a human challenge trial is important, and we'll hear a little more about the history later, I think, but in this instance is that there has been concern, and there's been concern that at the time when a trial of a vaccine might be necessary to test its efficacy, that is the late stage part of the trials, there may not be enough cases of COVID-19 circulating in the populations where such a trial is possible to conduct it, and therefore a challenge trial would be more efficient. We have, of course, seen that in a number of countries, including our own, there is ongoing high-level transmission of COVID-19, and indeed some ordinary phase 3 trials, regular kind of trial to test the efficacy of a vaccine, are beginning as we speak. The reason why a challenge trial remains a high priority, not to perform right this minute, but to prepare for, is, as we heard a few minutes ago from Congressman Foster, that there will be not one or two, but many possible vaccines. It is historically the case that the first vaccine discovered is rarely the very best one. And with concerted efforts, we can hope that this country and others will continue or will begin to get control over the epidemic. And we may reach a point where, in order to find a really good vaccine, we need to test it in a non-traditional way. There are other benefits of such trials which we can talk about later, but the real idea that brought us all together is that such trials may not be necessary, but if they are necessary, it's going to be very time sensitive to do them quickly. And so we should be investing now to prepare for them, figuring out the protocols, facilities where they could be done, the viral strains, and other preparations to make sure that in the instance where there is a vaccine candidate that looks promising, and this is judged to be an effective way to test the vaccine, we are not waiting for all those preparations that we could have been doing right now. Thank you.
Thank you. And you alluded to this a little bit, but just to tease it out a bit more concretely, could you explain how a challenge trial would be very different from the current phase 3 trials that are about to begin?
Sure. A phase 3 trial, like the ones that are beginning now for the Oxford and Moderna vaccines, essentially takes two groups of people usually. They are randomly chosen, people are randomly chosen to be in one group or the other when they enter the trial. And one group gets the vaccine candidate and the other group gets a placebo or a saline injection or some comparator that's not expected to be protective against COVID. Those groups are then followed. They are warned to to follow CDC guidelines and try to minimize their exposure. But even doing so in this situation, it's expected that a number of them will contract COVID. And the phase 3 trial compares the incidence of COVID disease or the incidence of infection or both, meaning it may or may not only look at symptomatic cases or also asymptomatic cases who might transmit. So there are different designs, but it will compare SARS-CoV-2, the virus infection in one group versus the other, and conclude that the vaccine works if it's significantly lower in the vaccinated group. A human challenge trial essentially doesn't wait for the exposures to happen. It has the advantage that we don't have to wonder whether everyone will actually take such care or virus transmission will go down and there won't be enough results, as has happened in previous trials during infectious disease emergencies, because the individuals are deliberately infected. It also means that it's a much smaller number of people involved, typically thousands of people in a phase 3 normal trial, and tens or hundreds in each group in a challenge trial. And that means that a much smaller number of people are put at risk of potential side effects or adverse effects of the vaccine. So that's another reason why they may be advantageous.
Great. And Mark, one of the main rationales that you've offered here for why challenge studies for COVID-19 would be useful is because they provide a faster answer on whether vaccines are effective compared to a conventional study. So as an epidemiologist, would you be able to explain how exactly this is the case and maybe give an example of a scenario where challenge studies would or would not be faster than a conventional study and why that might matter?
Sure. So the reason why they're faster is that from the time of starting the trial, essentially everyone in the trial, or at least in the first round of the trial, is infected on the day you start the trial. It's not waiting for people to get infected, but it happens immediately, and then you can follow them. So it takes time to analyze data and things, but you begin to gather data within a week or two of the start of the trial, and you have an answer relatively soon thereafter. With a phase 3 classical trial of the sort that's often done, you wait until people get infected, and there are different ways of designing the trials, but essentially they all rely on a certain number of people getting infected in the trial. The investigators don't know who got the vaccine and who didn't, so you wait until a certain number of events have accrued or for a certain amount of time, and then you break the code and find out were the people who got it mostly in the not vaccinated arm. So it takes longer because you have to wait for nature or for society to for people to get infected the regular way. And that can be fast in a very, very fast-moving epidemic, but typically people who enter trials are relatively cautious people in terms of protecting themselves. They're health-aware people, and so you are a bit at the mercy of the tension between they're doing the right thing for their own health and protecting themselves versus getting infected at in the trial to give you data. So that's the reason for the greater speed, and the exact amount of savings of time really depends on how fast people get infected in the other trial and on how long it takes to do the preparations and the preliminary parts of the challenge trial.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you. And now I'm going to move along and we're going to address a question here to Dr. Stanley Plotkin. So Stanley, you are the author of basically the definitive reference work on vaccination. So you might know more about the science of it than pretty much anyone else on the planet here. So the first question that I wanted to ask you about the history of challenge studies is essentially, are these trials a new idea? And where have we used them before and what have they accomplished?
So it's no secret or no surprise to anybody that vaccines have changed the world with respect to control of infectious diseases. Some of the major diseases are no longer seen in developed countries thanks to vaccination. So when SARS-2 came on the scene, it was obvious that we needed a vaccine. But one of the differences between the COVID-19 epidemic and prior disease is that we know little about the agent that causes it and other aspects of the disease. And we're sort of learning as we go along and trying to develop a preventive in order to save the world from this devastating outbreak. Now, in order to obtain basic biological information about the organism and about how to control it, people need information. And in the past, they have acquired some of this information on other infectious agents by doing challenge studies. For example, influenza, cholera, typhoid, rhinovirus that causes colds, malaria. Those have all been the subjects of human challenge trials in order to learn the biology of the agent and to test vaccines against those agents and to determine which are the best vaccines. So logically, that should apply to this devastating epidemic that we are facing, that is destroying society in many ways. And in order to rapidly develop vaccines, we need more biological information. That is why I and others have advocated human challenges as part of the study of vaccines against the virus, which is called SARS-2. Now, there are, as many people know, over 100 candidate vaccines, some of which are already in clinical development, but many of which are still being studied before going into the clinic. And we want to know which ones of those vaccines are likely to work. Now, can we find this out in the usual way by doing phase 1, 2, 3 trials? Yes, eventually, but it takes time. And in those trials, which involve people who don't get the vaccine and people who do, you don't always have all the specimens that you would like in order to sort things out. So human challenges can give us a quick readout on which vaccines actually can protect. They also can tell us something that we don't really yet know. Do people who have had SARS-2, have had COVID-19, are they protected from reinfection? We don't really know that yet, and challenging them could tell us. Also, very importantly, challenges can identify what are called the correlates of protection, which are basically the immune responses that people develop against a vaccine and which are the responses that protect them from later exposure to the organism for which the vaccine was developed. So we can compare multiple vaccines and determine which ones protect and how they protect and which ones give the best protection. And that could lead to provisional use, emergency use in high-risk people like healthcare workers. Now, can we learn the same things in the usual way? Eventually, but it will take longer, likely, to do that. And the information may not be as precise as it would be with information gained by human challenges. Now, what are the disadvantages? Well, of course, we don't wish any of the volunteers to become severely ill, and therefore we must have ways of treating them if they do become ill. And we now have several ways of doing that, which we think will protect challenged volunteers from serious disease. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Stanley. That was actually a superstar answer because I had a series of follow-up questions that I was going to ask you, but I think you managed to unpack pretty much everything that I wanted to know. So just as a brief overview, Stanley has talked then about how challenge trials could be used not just to accelerate vaccine development, but the other valuable scientific questions that they might be able to answer. And those include getting a better understanding of whether previously being infected with SARS-CoV-2 confers any immunity, and also helping understand things like the correlates of protection, which are basically like little markers that help us identify whether a person's immune system is responding to a vaccine in a way that indicates that it might offer them some protection. And challenge studies are better positioned to answer these because the data that they are providing is both clearer and more precise, but is also offered on a more accelerated timeline. So now I'm going to turn the conversation here to Rich. And Rich, you won the Nobel Prize in 1993 for discovering the intron. And you were instrumental to our organization in recruiting a number of Nobel laureates to sign our open letter, which was directed at Francis Collins. Now, why do you think that you and other laureates found this to be such a compelling cause? Oh, you're muted there.
The main reason is that we're all scientists, and so that we understand if you want to get a good result, a good experiment, a well-designed experiment is the way to go. And a challenge trial is a very well-designed experiment. You know that the person who has been given the vaccine will in fact be challenged by the virus, and then we will know, does the vaccine work? Does it not work? And the problem with doing the traditional way is we don't know who got infected, who didn't get infected. And so all you do is statistically hope that you get a result. Also with a challenge trial, you can follow the course of the infection so that we know that as soon as someone has become infected, and we can then take samples, we can monitor them, we can find out over a period of time what are the symptoms? When do symptoms first appear? If we wanted, for instance, to put a test in, we can say at what point can the test detect the infection as opposed to when the symptoms occur. You can get a lot of very valuable information about the cause of infection, the course of infection, and also in the long run, have a much better idea of how to treat patients who have been infected.
Fantastic, thank you for that. And now I'm going to move sort of over to Nir. So Nir, as of mid-July, there was broad consensus, and this includes from the NIH, on the need to prepare for challenge studies. However, there seems to be a little bit less agreement on how urgent this preparation needs to be. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more for us.
The answer is simple. Thank you, Sophie. Very, very urgent. There is really, for some of the preparations, for example, preparing facilities, there is really just a dollar amount that they would cost. They do not involve risk for participants. And it's an absolute no-brainer that economically it's worth it investing in these facilities just in case we need to use challenge trials to expedite arriving at a vaccine and therefore expediting the end of a global pandemic that is costing us such an order more economically every day that is continuing, or many orders more.
And just to clarify as well, before we move on to the next question, those kinds of investments, they wouldn't just be contributing to facilities that could be used for challenge trials, right? This would be strengthening infrastructure that could be continued to use in similar ways.
That's true. And there are also additional investments, for example, in growing culture, which hopefully the NIH is already pursuing. And there are other basically infrastructure preparations that would serve us well in years to come. That's true.
And now you've spoken publicly many times at this point about how to minimize risks to COVID-19 challenge trial participants. And we've kind of talked about this a little bit today, but we know that it includes restricting participation to young adults, people without comorbidities. So this means no one with diabetes, no one with a heart condition or a compromised immune system, et cetera. Now, other discussions on ethical considerations seem to be centering around whether it is appropriate to proceed without a rescue therapy. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that are.
That's very correct. And we now also have additional potential inclusion-exclusion criteria that would help us really home in even more than we could when we were writing on who is likely to be at low risk of severe disease, even if they get infected in the trial, for example, based on blood type. So that's very important. That helps us further. Overall, even opponents of challenge trials seem to agree that the risks are commensurate, even at the time, before the new exclusion criteria came in, commensurate ballpark to risks from, say, live kidney donation, which is a practice that we approve and is widely supported by doctors. Although it's not good for the kidney donor, although there is some risk of death, 1 in 3,000 roughly, for donors, the reason we approve of it is basically two factors. One, the kidney donor gave their fully informed consent. We would not approve it if they didn't consent or if we suspected the consent is of poor quality. And they help one person. Well, in this case, if we expedite finding a vaccine, we're talking about so many more, deaths, morbidities, impoverishments averted than in the case of a single kidney donation. That by analogy, this would be appropriate. There are some complications. It's not so clear where exactly the risks are, but for all we know, we do not know that the risks are far higher. So for the time being, and especially with more and more therapies coming in and making the balance easier and easier to accept, it seems like a risk that we don't like. I would have loved if this was risk-free, but a risk that is tolerable and that we should accept in light of the enormous global health value of expediting the end of this pandemic.
Thank you. And now, just briefly, because we're getting towards the end of our panel time in particular, but all of you were signatories on the open letter that we recently addressed to the director of the NIH. And I was wondering what you think that the NIH should be doing that they're not doing already. So Mark, I think you might have mentioned something kind of along these lines before, and I was wondering if you could reiterate there.
Sure. I think there are a number of things, but they fall into a few categories. One is preparing facilities where this can be done in a way that's safe for the individuals involved, comfortable for those individuals while they're participating, and most importantly, will minimize the chance of spread to the community. So that's the first piece. A second piece is to grow viral strains that can be used in these challenge trials. A third is to convene a group of experts to figure out exactly how the trial is going to be done. There are a number of questions about exactly how it would be designed, what the dose would be, how you would determine that dose, and that is going to take some arguing over and scientific discussion before hopefully a consensus is reached. And scientists love to disagree with each other, so that will take some time, and I think that might be even the most urgent piece of it. And those are the main things. And then some of the logistical arrangements, like there's debate among ethicists about whether paying people to participate in something like this is a good idea, or can be seen as some form of compulsion, and different people have different views. There are questions about, I think it's not much of a question, I would say, some form of compensation being arranged in case something unexpectedly bad happens. And then a decision about who could participate and exactly what the categories of low risk are and how we would find those people. And so there are a number of preliminaries that all involve just money and not very much compared to the amount of money that this pandemic is costing, and no risk in themselves. And those should be worked out as soon as possible in order to have this ready to go when we need it, should we need it.
Fantastic. And Stanley, I was wondering if you also wanted to offer your comments on that.
Well, I think Mark has covered the situation pretty well, but what I would like to add is to point out that the usual way of determining whether a vaccine is effective or not is the so-called phase 3 trial. And in fact, at least one vaccine has entered into a phase 3 trial. And in that phase 3 trial, what you do is you randomly assign volunteers to be vaccinated or to receive a control, a placebo substance. And then, of course, you wait. You wait for the disease to occur in that population. And what you hope for, even though as a human being you don't want people to get sick and die, nevertheless, in that context, you are hoping that the control population will have disease, and probably severe disease, and maybe even death. And that is just the nature of phase 3 trials and how we've done them since the beginning of vaccines, so to speak. Well, my point is that doing things in the usual way is not without risk, that people will suffer if we do things in the usual way. And so that the effort here using human challenge is to get to answers more quickly and ultimately to save lives and disease at the other end.
Thank you for those additional comments. I have to say that is also something that I find very persuasive as somebody who myself has identifies as willing to volunteer for to be exposed to coronavirus in the guise of a challenge study. The idea that I could be undertaking what I see to be as a reasonable risk in order to help a number of people seems to me to make a lot more sense than participating in a standard phase 3 trial.
May I make one other point, just for the listeners, so that there's no mistake, and that is that even with human challenge trials, we would still have to accumulate data on the overall safety of a candidate vaccine in order to obtain a license and to enable general use. So it would not be skimping on the evidence for safety of any particular vaccine.
I think that's an important clarification. Thank you, Stanley. So now that you have all had a chance to hear from our expert panel, I want to again invite people to submit any remaining questions that you might have. And to best facilitate this process, I wanted to invite you to continue to submit questions in the chat box. So if you can just pull that up by clicking on the little messenger symbol, and you can add that with your name and your affiliation, and I'll work to address them to the appropriate experts. And then as they come in, I have sort of a bank of other questions that I think could be interesting. But first, I wanted to invite everyone in case anyone has anything that they would like clarified. I guess whilst we're waiting on some of those questions to be submitted, I'm curious, perhaps Nir, if you could speak to, so we've spoken a little bit about what we think our federal government should be doing in order to prepare for challenge studies. Is this on a par with what other governments around the world are doing, and are there other groups that have taken action where we have not?
So earlier this month, Oxford University announced that it is planning to do challenge trials by the end of the year. That's quite striking because Oxford University is also ahead of everybody else in conducting phase 3 trials. So that really supports what Mark and Stanley were talking about. These people who are, what happened is that they started in the UK at a time when there were many there was very high community spread of coronavirus. And by the time you recruit people and start seeing an immune response in phase 3, this disease is, it's not waiting for you. It may move elsewhere. And in fact, the higher community spread, the more likely your public health authorities to become serious and try containing the spread. So it becomes, so what they did is they had to move to Brazil and South Africa, and now that's what they're doing. And they have been burnt, and they are preparing just in case to perform challenge trials, because they understand that there is this huge uncertainty when you conduct these phase 3 trials. So it is very true that we shouldn't put all our eggs in this one basket of phase 3. I would say even for this first batch of trials, as Oxford University understands, and certainly not for later batches. And there is interest from around the world in conducting challenge trials for later vaccine candidates. People understand that they might not have access to vaccines, even if they are proven safe and efficacious in the first round as readily as they want to, and they are seeking other ways that are affordable to them, that are more timely to conduct challenge trials.
And that was it was a timely reference to sort of equitable and accessible vaccine distribution, because we have an excellent question that's been submitted by, I believe, Hannah. And that is, how is it that scientists can use a historically informed approach to make sure that marginalized or disadvantaged communities, including women, people of color, or those from a working class background, in order to make sure that these communities are not bearing an unfair burden of this type of medical testing? So Mark, I was wondering if you might be able to speak to that a little bit.
Sure. Thanks for that question. I think this is an important issue in all sorts of medical testing. And I think the first thing to say is that that's a very important question to raise, not only about human challenge trials, but about all sorts of trials that are being undertaken. I mentioned earlier the discussion about whether paying people to be in trials is ethically admirable or ethically problematic. And that is motivated, the people who consider it problematic are motivated in part by the concern that it becomes exploitative of people who can use that amount of money and others get a free ride. So I think that's one reason why that part is ethically debated. I think that the critical thing, and then the other thing I would say is that we need a vaccine that we know works in a variety of people. So at the same time that we don't want an undue burden on groups that are at high risk, which people of color and lower socioeconomic status people have this epidemic. We don't want to burden them with medical research, but we also don't want to exclude them. And that's so I think it goes both ways. So I think that the best way I understand, and maybe others will chime in, but the best way I understand to do this is to ensure that the consent process is extremely rigorous, so that people who are bearing this burden, whoever they may be, are people who fully understand what they're doing, who understand that it is a risk that they are taking on behalf of the global community. And so I think we don't want to disincentivize certain groups, but we also don't want to somehow make it fall on those groups. And I think ensuring real understanding in the consent process is an important part of the answer.
And then Nir, I was just wondering if you could potentially add to that and speak a little bit more to how we might be able to ensure that truly robust informed consent would be achieved in the context of these trials.
There are challenges in obtaining informed consent robustly in every medical trial. We know of some psychologists have these fantastic descriptions of biases that candidate participants have, especially if they are less educated. There are people who trust too much these people in white robes. They don't understand randomization. And there are some systematic things that we can say about this. But we also have maybe 40 years of experience of dealing with that and trying to ensure high quality informed consent. And this is what we're doing in every medical trial, especially when the stakes are high, and the personal stakes are certainly high in this one. So there would be procedures such as, it's not going to be enough to dump some list of risks on people and tell them, deal with this, do you consent? Yes. We would need to really ensure that they comprehend the risks and what we know and what we do not know about the risks. There are ways to insert that comprehension. There are these annoying computer programs that will not let you move to the next page. We've all filled them for our workplaces before you prove that you understand, that you give the right answer, and they would be used and things of that sort. I want to address here a common ethical worry that arose in the press. Many people, bioethicists and scientists and others, have said, look, we don't quite understand COVID-19. So nobody's informed, not even the scientists. So how can there cannot be informed consent, they said. That's a misunderstanding of the validity conditions for informed consent. When, in centuries past, people had an incorrect understanding of certain diseases, incorrect understanding of certain scientific truths, but we don't say all research back then was battery. What we say is scientists at the time should have conveyed to candidate participants their understanding and ensure that their understanding is the understanding that the participants have. And this is what we will need to do here. So if you will, part of what participants will need to understand is there are things we don't know, and they would need to speak that back to the people who test their comprehension.
Maybe could I just add a little bit more? I think there is a very good reason why research ethics has become an important field that recognizes horrible abuses that have happened in the past in Tuskegee and Guatemala and Nazi Germany and elsewhere. The main problem, there were many problems with each of those examples, but one of the major problems was a lack of voluntariness and proper consent. As Nir has said, there are many things you can do to someone, like give them a virus with their consent, that you would be prosecuted for doing if you did it without their consent. And I must say the reason why some of us started raising this issue 3 months ago or more was so that we would have a robust process that said, this is not going to be cutting corners, this is not going to be rushing things, this is not going to be trying to compel people who can't voluntarily agree to be in the trial. We want to have a process that is orderly and ensures that it's getting people involved who understand as best possible the risks. Anecdotally, I can also say I don't know the race or the ethnicity of many of the people who wrote to me emails saying, how can I volunteer? They have been mostly males, and they have been mostly professional males, lawyers and accountant type people. They have, that's a very small sample and it's not representative, but my point is that of the many thousand volunteers who have now signed up on One Day Sooner, this is at least a large number of them are highly educated and high apparently high socioeconomic status.
Yeah, and I'll just take that opportunity to acknowledge too that we at One Day Sooner do recognize that there are some questions about how to make sure that we're using history as a lesson to make sure that we don't repeat mistakes of the past, and that there's also complex questions surrounding achieving racial equity, not just in challenge trials, but also in vaccine distribution in general. And we're planning on actually establishing a symposium that we're going to hold in September discussing more of these issues, which you are welcome to join us for. But I'm just going to quickly move on to some of the other questions that have been asked. So Alex has a fantastic question that I've seen asked a lot, and I'm going to address this to you, Stanley. And he's wondering, basically, if you're only enrolling a young, healthy population for a challenge trial, how do you ensure that the resulting data is generalizable? And would you still need to conduct other studies afterwards in order to make sure that that data was usable for the broader population?
That's a good question, and it's a question that comes up with every challenge study. So the answer, or my answer to that, is this: that you determine in the young, healthy population what are the kinds of responses that are protective, and indeed, if there are responses that are what we call enhancing, that is, make the disease worse, that's also something you want to define. And then you go to, let's say, the elderly population, and you give them the same vaccine, and you examine their responses. Now, by that time, you have more safety data, so you are willing to go to populations that have higher risks. But the point is that in those populations, you're not challenging them, you are vaccinating them and looking for their responses and hoping that they will respond with the same kind of protective responses as did the younger people. Now, it is an axiom of immunology that the elderly, myself included, will not respond as well as the younger. But if they have at least a part of the response, perhaps a smaller response, but still something that could give them some protection, one will have learned an extremely important fact. And so my answer to the question is that you have to identify something in the challenge trials that you can then carry over to other populations and determine whether they produce the same thing.
Thank you for that, Stanley. I will just add too that another compelling response to the question of generalizability was actually something I heard Mark say on a podcast probably about 2 months ago or so now. But it's also just worth noting that even if a challenge trial could identify a vaccine candidate that was only efficacious in a young population, that's still no mean feat. And it does give you access to a vaccine that then allows a significant, non-trivial portion of our population to start getting back into the workplace and protecting people that might be working on the front lines. So I thought that was an interesting response to that point as well. And just before we move on to our wrap up and a review of some of the action items that we at One Day Sooner might recommend that some of you can take, I want to answer Congressman Foster's question here. That seems important, given that he invited us all here today. He was wondering if the virus mutates in a way that makes existing vaccine candidates ineffective, is it faster or more efficient to restart development and redeploy new iterations of those vaccines if we have the challenge trial facilities in place or protocols for these trials in place? And I'll open that one up to the panel at large if any of you have any comments on that.
Yes, well, let me say that first of all, the virologic evidence thus far is that although there are mutations, they are not yet critical mutations. There's no evidence yet that a vaccine against, let's say, the European strains would not also have worked on Chinese strains. So that so far, that's good. But even if there were a change, for example, as happens with influenza, still the principle of protection would probably be the same. So you might have to switch the antigen somewhat, but you'd be looking for the same kind of protective response.
Perhaps another way of rephrasing this question too is for the preparations that are being made on a logistical level, so improvements to biocontainment facilities or vaccine development facilities for the use of challenge trials. These improvements can also help facilitate vaccine developments in other ways. Is that the case?
Well, yes, certainly. Certainly.
Fantastic. And then, so I want to thank the panel for their time and their expertise. We wouldn't have been able to answer these questions and have such a fruitful conversation without you. So I wanted to thank you for that. I'm going to invite our Director of Legislative and Advocacy arm of our organization now to speak to, and hopefully Nima, this will answer your question, to speak to some of the major action items for you as congressional staffers and offer some options about where you might be able to take things after today's briefing. So Natasha, if you wanted to take over now.
Absolutely. And hopefully everyone can hear me okay now. Cool. Thank you so much for speaking with all of us today. We really appreciate the time that you guys spent to come hear some of our panel of experts and ask some questions about challenge trials. Over the past few weeks, we've been reaching out to many of your offices. So many of the participants on today's call are people I have previously spoken with. Although I do recognize that there are a few new people on the call today too. And so at least for those people too, I'd love to circle back and have just a one-on-one conversation with you about challenge trials. Overall, we've been trying to make a lot of connections with the federal agencies and take more decisive action and more preparatory actions for challenge trials. You may have seen that we have submitted an open letter co-signed by some of the people on this call today, as well as 100, other Nobel laureates and many other scientists as well too, asking for Dr. Collins of the NIH to take more decisive actions on challenge trials. And so in the coming couple weeks or so, we might be sending a formal request to his office to meet with our organization and discuss the potential logistics for setting up challenge trials. This is definitely useful in the sense that as the University of Oxford has set up their own challenge trials in the UK, that other countries are beginning to take actions here. And if the NIH and other federal agencies who are the forefront of this type of research should be taking these kinds of actions as well too. So that's one potential avenue as well. We have legislative language that we have composed and submitted to a few folks as well too. This legislative language is on generally in appropriations. So generally speaking about what fundings we can set aside for things like biocontainment units and for the vaccine to ensure vaccine equity that is distributed amongst people. And so if you are willing to hear our thoughts about that and to have a conversation about that, we'd love to circle back with you on that. I know we have at least one conversation with one of the participants on today's call for that as well. And just in general, we'd love to collaborate with your offices too as well. We are here because we believe that challenge trials are the most efficient way, that is one potential means to accelerate a coronavirus vaccine. But we recognize that this crisis has a lot of different facets as well too. There's a question about whether or not there's going to be a sufficient diversity of participants participating in any kind of trials, whether they are challenge trials or not. It's important to have the data necessary to have a complete sense of how any vaccine might affect individual vulnerable groups. It's also important to recognize how the vaccine might be distributed to people as well too. How are we going to get the vaccine to vulnerable communities across the United States, as well as to other places in the world potentially? And so we love to hear about your potential constituents' concerns as well too. And so that's another conversation I'd love to circle back with you. So just in general, I'd love to continue to have conversations with you guys. I'd love to give you guys continued updates about our organization and then about our actions with challenge trials. And essentially, I'd love to hear how we can continue to talk to the government and get them to make firm decisions about whether or not to proceed with this type of methodology.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Natasha. And then just before we wrap up today, Congressman Foster kindly alerted me that Dr. Roberts has raised his hand. I'm not as familiar with the Microsoft Teams landscape, so this is new to me. But Rich, did you have a comment that you wanted to add here?
Well, it actually pertained to something said earlier, but I have some general comments. One is informed consent is actually quite easy to do if you don't have a large number of people. So if you have 30,000 people you're trying to reach and educate to give informed consent, that can take a huge amount of work to do it well. If we're just talking about 100 or 200 people who might be involved in a challenge trial, then I think the whole issue of educating these people, making sure that they give true consent, that they fully understand what is going on, becomes much easier. I also think one thing that is worth saying is that if you run a challenge trial, the first thing you do will be to provide the vaccine. But the next thing you do is to check whether they have produced a response. Have they, in fact, come up and started to produce antibodies that you believe may be protective? If they haven't, then those people would not be challenged. Right? It's only the people who already have the response that would be challenged. And I think this means that there is a measure of safety there already, just because you know exactly what to look for and you know how to proceed. So I think there are a lot of possibilities. And I might finally say that there are at least a couple of Nobel laureates who have also agreed that they would participate in challenge trials. I'm one of them.
You're muted.
I am too. Thank you for that. I was trying to be respectful, and then I just did myself in. Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Rich. Before we finish up here, Congressman Foster, did you have anything else that you wanted to add? Oh, you're also muted. I'm glad I'm not the only one.
We can do it simultaneously. There we go. Well, I just want to say that I've had a number of discussions with my Republican colleagues on this, and this is not a naturally partisan issue. There's the moral analogy between war heroes who are asked to take risks to save the greater, for the greater good of the military unit, is something that is appreciated on both sides of the aisle. I've also seen a lot of interest in making sure that Congress gets a true idea of what the schedule is. What is actually happening here, because unfortunately of some times when things appear to have been politicized in terms of, the likely schedule for things like testing and so on. And so, partly as a result of that, on the coronavirus committee, we have Democrats and Republicans have come together to ask the Government Accountability Office to have a special dedicated group doing real-time oversight of everything having to do with so-called Project Warp Speed, the high-speed development of vaccines and therapeutics. And so it's my hope that as this proceeds, it will really proceed on a factual basis, knowing what's really happening out there and giving Congress and the public a very good idea of what's happening, when it's likely to happen, what's working, what isn't, and so that we can sort of make the decisions about things like challenge trials, in a very democratic way, and so the small d democratic way, and so it's just, I'm right now pretty encouraged that we're getting a thoughtful debate from the whole public in the U.S. At a time when we're not getting thoughtful debates in other areas.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your comments on that. I couldn't agree more, and it's definitely been a fascinating thing for me to watch as somebody who has not been living in the US for her entire life. So I want to thank all of you again for joining us today and being willing to keep an open mind about these issues. I would encourage you to reach out to Natasha or to other members of our organization if you're interested in discussing challenge trials further, or if you want information about what more you can do to encourage the NIH to proceed more urgently with their preparations for these challenge trials. And I thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a lovely afternoon. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank
Sophie.
you.
Thank you.